To be a communicator, you have to be honest. You have to tell the audience what is it that's being communicated. There's a famous triptych, 3 things, yes. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you told them. That's what communication consists of. That's what I enjoy doing. That's what I hope I'm pretty good at doing, as contrasted with discovering things. Embracing or sophisticated as it has become. Body seems to run and to continue to build up to the department.
The title of Paul Halmos's autobiography, I Want to Be a Mathematician, piques the reader's curiosity. Paul, you were already well along in your career when you wrote it, and the subtitle, an automathography in 3 parts, has us puzzled as well. What can you tell us about the title and the subtitle, and what do they tell us about you?
It is, as it almost says, an autobiography. I coined the silly word automathography, but that expresses what it is. I am a teacher. Frequently I'm a teacher. I often want to be a teacher. And I wanted to teach some of my juniors, peers, and students what it means to be a mathematician, what you have to do. And there was a famous and highly respected, deservedly respected book of Norbert Wiener titled I Am a Mathematician. And when I began to write the book you refer to, I didn't know what to title it. I had working titles, and one of them was I Too Am a Mathematician, and various other variations on Wiener's choice of words. But my good friend, highly respected editor, Walter Kaufmann-Bühler, rejected them all as being too silly or too imitative or something, until I reached, I want to be a mathematician. Then he said, that's it.
He was sort of always teaching. You were sort of always learning from him, even when you were not in the classroom, just social conversation. There was always sort of a feeling that this was a learning situation or a testing situation. And so I was always on my toes.
I was pretty good at math when I was 12, 13, 14 years old. And I had choices as to what I wanted to do when I went to college. My father was a medical doctor, and a couple of my brothers were in medical business. So that was held out in front of me as the right thing to do. And so my major as a freshman in college was chemical engineering. But I got tired of that very quickly, and I changed naturally to philosophy. And when I flunked an important exam in philosophy, I decided that the proper thing I wanted to do was mathematics. And so I changed to mathematics, and I don't know, I was about to say, and I've been a mathematician ever since, but I think the more honest and modest thing to say is I've been trying to be a mathematician ever since. I graduated from college in 1934 with a major in mathematics, but that was almost meaningless in the sense in which I now use the word I didn't know any mathematics. But about that time, when I was going on to my first year of graduate school, I met my inspiration, Joe Doob, who came to the University of Illinois at that time. And he and I got along fine. He was only about 5 or 6 years older than I, but he seemed infinitely older in wisdom and mathematical experience. And we played squash together, and we talked politics together, and we talked mathematics together. So I'd say my major inspiration in mathematics was he as a person and he as a mathematician.
You wrote that in the spring of 1936, your first year in graduate school, there came a day when for the first time the underlying ideas of calculus really became clear to you. Tell us about that day.
I remember the emotion. I really was, as it were, inspired. It was silly stuff, calculus, that mathematicians look down on and sneer at nowadays, about what do epsilons and deltas mean. And the answer is it's easy stuff. But it wasn't easy for me at all. It was a total mystery, just a bunch of symbols that I had to memorize, which is, of course, an obscene word in mathematics. And then suddenly I was with my friend Warren Ambrose. We were explaining things to each other. And one thing I said suddenly rang true. I understood not the epsilons and the deltas and the symbols, but the idea that something flowed continuously, and what words tried to do is to describe that discretely, concretely. And it was a major step. And suddenly I saw what all these other guys, Doob and Ambrose and so on, had been talking about. And at that minute, for what it's worth, I became a mathematician. It's a routine to every grown mathematician to have a vague idea and to formulate it, to formalize it, to express it, to verbalize it precisely. And that is something I'd never known how to do until that moment.
How did you first become aware of R.L. Moore and his teaching methods?
In a personal sort of way, by which I don't mean the person of R.L. Moore, but a fellow student of mine in graduate school, Felix Welch, who was a Texan and who studied for a while with R.L. Moore. And when he came up north, he used to talk and remember and dream about R.L. Moore. So I heard about him and his so-called method. And I thought that was interesting. Just interesting. Not yet necessarily attractive or fascinating, but curious. But the more I heard, the more impressed I became that it seems to be an effective way, well, of teaching, of inspiring people to think for themselves. And I don't remember what my first contact with R.L. Moore was. Does everybody know that that stands for Robert Lee Moore, as in Robert E. Lee? But anyhow, I either wrote to Robert Lee or when I was going through Texas, telephoned and asked permission to visit him, which he politely and kindly granted. And I had many such personal sessions with him, which was fun. It was, in a sense, inspiring. He didn't teach me mathematics, but he taught me an attitude. He taught me an attitude toward mathematics, which did great things for me. And I veer off on an irrelevancy. I remember one of our early meetings when I had, as usual, my camera in my hand, and I asked permission to take his picture, which he grudgingly granted. But he said, I won't smile. He said, I look silly when I try to smile.
Could you describe this Moore method as you understand it?
Well, the world existed before Robert Lee Moore, and the method used to be known as the Socratic method. Socrates either invented it or is credited with it. The do-it-yourself method. And Moore sharpened it, developed it, pointed it in a certain direction, and it worked like a charm. I remember the first time I actually met R.L. Moore. As I said, he was polite to me and kind, and took me to a class that he was teaching that morning, a very elementary class, beginning calculus. And it was near the beginning of the course. He walked in and he gave the guys some elementary definitions, reminded them or told them what is a number and what is a function and so on, and asked a question or two.
Would you work out an argument for yourself for next time? Are you going to be sorry that you didn't follow it?
No, I didn't. I don't want to follow it if I can work out an argument for myself.
He then pointed to somebody and said, "Mr. Smith, what's the answer?" "Oh, you don't know?" "Mr. Jones, what's the answer?" And when obviously he didn't get answers because they were too difficult and students weren't used to that approach, he said, "All right, class dismissed." And the next class he walked in and said, "Mr. Smith, what's the answer to the first question?" And the guys caught on very soon and collaborated and tried to answer questions. And another thing was they were not only supposed to ask and answer questions, but they were supposed to criticize. They are watching themselves, they're watching their peers, their colleagues, and they are criticizing it. Criticizing doesn't necessarily mean putting it down, but examining it and seeing where you can go from there. So the Moore method, the Socratic method, is definitely a collaborative process. It isn't that the teacher lights a match or that the students take off by themselves. They both have to be there. The firewood has to be there and the match has to be there. Moore himself almost never criticized. He almost never said, "That's wrong." But he very often said, "I don't understand that." And of course the kids caught on and I caught on. It meant, "You're talking nonsense, friend. Say something intelligent." How students reacted to R.L. Moore and his questions. They resented it. They thought he was trying to get out of work. He wasn't teaching them anything. But it wasn't long before they caught on that that wasn't so at all. The questions were supposed to, well, inspire might be too hard a word, but were supposed to generate an attitude and generate information. So he kept asking these questions, and then when he didn't get answers, dismissed the class and began the same place the next time. And the students quickly caught on. This wasn't just a game, which it was, and it was a fun game, but it was a way of acquiring information. Anyhow, as far as the type of material is concerned, I think the so-called Moore method or Socratic method is applicable everywhere, to all subjects, and at all levels. But of course, in a slightly different way. The way you try to inspire a freshman calculus class is different from how you try to inspire a single student with whom you're sitting down and having a cup of coffee. But the principal aspect of the method is still that you don't say, you ask. You don't, well, how shall I say, stimulate is the word, but that's too vague a word. But now you present enough material so that they are stimulated and that they can offer answers and, most important, ask questions themselves.
How do you teach a Moore-style class?
After the routine stuff as to who I am and who they are and what the number of this course is, I write the name of R.L. Moore on the board and tell them that's an important name in mathematics, and in particular in American mathematics, and why he's important, and what the so-called Moore method is. And they're interested. Students want to hear that. That's a curious thing. At first, they suspect that I'm trying to get out of work rather than teaching them some mathematics. But they soon catch on that this is somehow, even talking about Moore, let alone using something like the Moore method, is actually succeeding in teaching them some mathematics, and they get more and more interested and contribute more and more.
Who do you call on, and in what order?
That's an important part of the Moore method that I learned from Moore himself. At first, of course, you call on them at random. But you very soon get an idea of who is sharp, who is anxious to talk, who is smart and who is dumb. And either literally on a piece of paper or mentally in your mind, you order them. And then you call on them, starting with the worst, with the guy who knows less, with the guy who's demonstrated that he can think the least. Certainly not to embarrass them, but in order to keep the course from turning into a lecture course by the smart guys. And that works pretty well. You have to be kind. You have to be firm. But it's possible to be both those things. You call on the weak guys, and when you can't get any more out of him, when he gives up, then you say, all right, if it isn't Mr. Smith, Mr. Jones, and so on. And you work up gradually to the best student in class.
He was interested in the students' development. He was very generous about the level they were at when they came into his classes. What he wanted to see was he wanted to see progress while they were in his class. He wanted to see them studying and trying hard, and he praised them if they did improve, if they studied and if they made gains on learning the material. He did talk about the students that he thought were the brightest students. He had a funny, again, sort of the playful side of Paul Halmos. After he'd meet the students the first day, he would turn over the roll and he would write on the back the grade he thought they were going to earn by the end of the quarter. And he was remarkably accurate. I mean, the grade that he thought they were going to earn just on meeting them the first time was very often correct.
I know he ranked his students. I don't know if he publicly ranked his students, but he did say who was the top student that he ever had. It was, I think, Don Saracen, he thought was his best student.
In 1961, I was a math graduate student in Ann Arbor. I had passed the oral exams, but really didn't know where I was headed. I was sort of clueless, and Paul Halmos had just been hired. I had heard that he was well known, that he'd written a book on measure theory. That was about all I knew about him. And he was slated to teach a course in functional analysis. So the year before I had taken the same course and thought I really didn't understand the subject, so I decided to sit in on his course. The time he walked into the class at the first meeting has stayed in my memory because it was sort of an electrifying moment. Somehow he walked in and immediately engaged all the students. He had a commanding presence as a lecturer. Paul was giving it in his version of the so-called Moore method, which means that he didn't do a lot of lecturing. He would give definitions and talk about things and provide the students with a lot of problems to work on. And I worked on the problems. So after a few weeks in the semester, he required every student, even the ones like me who were just visiting, to make an appointment with him in his office. And it was a non-trivial commitment of his time because there were maybe about 20 or so students in the class. So I went to visit him in his office at the appointed time. Mostly he just wanted to know who we were, what we were doing there, just to get to know us. And he asked, had I been working on the problems? And I said, well, yeah, I solved most of them. And he said something very encouraging to that, which was a boost to my morale, because here was this famous person saying, good work.
How do you deal with the loudmouths, the shrinking violets, or buffoons in your class?
You light a fire under them, and you light a fire under the shrinking violet, which is not easy to do, and perhaps a little cruel, but I soon learned their names. That's an important part of communication. And I say, Mr. Renz, what's the answer to this question? You don't know? Well, let's think about it together. Is there an easier question we could ask to which we might be able to find the answer? In other words, I try, step by step, to lead them through the thinking that we as mathematicians always do.
What about someone who's a buffoon or just sounds off in class? How do you sort of handle that?
Oh, you kick them. Not literally, but just about. You step on them. You say, that's a silly question. That doesn't belong here. You're just playing. We're supposed to be here to get something done. No, you just tell them the truth. I try not to make them feel bad, but you damn well make the point. When a student doesn't see something, tell him. When a student does see something, tell him. But don't try to keep secrets, don't be mysterious, be explicit.
What makes a great teacher? Well, what makes a good teacher?
I regard those as more or less the same question. What makes a good teacher? What makes a great teacher? And furiously, my mind is rippling through the teachers I've known and that I'm willing to call great. And well, R.L. Moore's name has come up perhaps too often by now in this conversation, but my own great friend and personal supervisor, Joe Doob, is a great teacher. He plays himself down. He hardly confesses to being a teacher, but he's a great one. He's a great one in the sense that he inspires you, that he says nonsense when something is nonsense, that he says, hey, that's all right, when it is all right. And he doesn't explicitly say, shouldn't we do this or shouldn't you have done that? But in effect, by asking the right questions at the right time, he is making suggestions. So Moore and Doob and my friend whose name keeps coming up in this conversation, Warren Ambrose, were great teachers. I've known some other people who were considerably less than great teachers, but they were inspiring, great men just the same. My one-time colleague, now no longer alive, Irving Siegel, attracted some of the best students who were visible on the horizon to him by being annoying, by being nasty, by asking almost unanswerable questions. I think he did it on purpose. I don't think he was unkind, but students took it hard and it made them work. And he produced some of the best students that could be produced.
In learning mathematics, which is more important, nature or nurture?
I suspect it's nature, but obviously I can't be sure. And it must be, at least in part, nurture. You don't invent mathematics from the ground up. So you're taught it, and you're taught who did what before you came on the scene. But certain people just couldn't possibly be mathematicians, not because they're dumb, but because they don't have that bent of mind. They don't want to, or are in a sense unable to, think the way mathematicians do. So if I had to give a one-word answer, it would be nature, but it definitely has to be mixed with nurture. An essential part of being a mathematician is to know what other mathematicians did. So nurture is unavoidable, but nature plays perhaps the biggest part in being creative.
How is breadth of coverage related to depth of coverage?
Do you try to make your students widely informed so that they know all of mathematics? Or do you dig down deep so that they know one part very well and can then perhaps dig another inch deeper? I don't think the distinction is all that great, but I admit that it definitely exists. And insofar as it comes to a choice between them, I would choose depth every time. I think if you know something very well and keep trying to know it better, then you expand. You must expand to other subjects, to nearby subjects. And the deeper down you go, the broader the nearby becomes.
What belongs in various courses? For example, how would you decide what to include in a linear algebra course?
All right. Suppose you tell me that here it is August and next month in September I'm supposed to try to teach a course in linear algebra. I'd sit down with one of my favorite sheets of yellow paper and start scribbling on it. I'd scribble isolated words and phrases. Vector space, linear transformation, example, and tuples of numbers, and so on and so forth. I'd have a couple dozen or more such phrases. Then I'd write them down on individual pieces of paper and play solitaire with them. Arrange them, see in what groups they belong, see in what order they can be presented. It's an infinite amount of labor. The teacher has to prepare. Students and colleagues sometimes think it's a lazy way of teaching. You don't do anything, you just walk into class and ask questions, but that isn't so at all. You go into class after many hours of preparation, of preparing the questions, and of preparing a dyadic graph. If he answers this, then next. If he answers that, then next something else. So it takes an infinite amount of preparation. It takes being very much on your toes. Anything a student says has to be listened to politely, and if necessary, has to be corrected. Preparation, attention, and almost never correction. You almost never say, this is what you should have done. But very often, a question. I wonder what we should have done.
How can teachers develop and strengthen curiosity in students? And I know that you think that curiosity is very important.
Well, an obvious answer is by asking questions, but I don't think that's fully the right answer. Somewhat closer to the right answer is by trying to stimulate students to ask questions. We all use the word, we all say we're doing mathematics. And I think what it means, what it should mean for students is the same thing. I think students should do research in their subject, at their level. They can't invent the calculus for themselves, but you can give them a definition, you can give them a direction, you can ask them a question, and you say, find out, tell me the answer. Tell me the answer right here and now. Go up to the blackboard and start talking, start thinking. And if you absolutely cannot do it, then go home and think. But for heaven's sakes, don't look it up in a book till you give up. Looking it up in a book is giving up.
So he was a great champion of the problem-oriented method of teaching, the Moore method sometimes called, though he had a milder and gentler version of it than Moore himself. Moore himself would lock all the closets with the books in them and make the students do everything absolutely for themselves, and there was a great spirit of competition in the room with Moore, I think, too. Halmos, my impression, I never actually saw him do it, was that he had a more liberal approach to the thing, which is, I think, very influential. It got people thinking again in a context larger than Moore's of how that approach could be useful. And Halmos himself wrote this problem book on Hilbert spaces and championed the method generally, talked about it, wrote about it, and that's where I learned about it and where I began to think it was a good idea.
What do you think about mathematics education in the United States?
PhD training and research training in this country is at least the equal of that in any other, and put us at the forefront and will keep us there for a long time. The weaknesses are elsewhere. The weaknesses, I think, are at the beginning. I think the way we teach grade school children and high school children, and to some extent college students, is not good. We baby them. We don't force them to do things for themselves. Emphasis, they don't force them to do things. We spoon feed them.
Are some areas of mathematics more important than others?
That's a dangerous question. I don't quite know what we want to mean by areas of mathematics here. Do we want to make areas such as logic as opposed to analysis as opposed to etc.? And if so, I'd say no. I'd say all mathematics is one. And that everything we learn about logic teaches us something about calculus, and everything we learn about that teaches us something about matrices. So mathematics is a unit.
What are some of your favorite areas?
The more I learn, the more I need to learn, and the more I want to learn. My own personal favorites have changed very greatly from decade to decade. And while I used to sneer at analysis and say it was messy, many people call me an analyst. Algebra and analysis used to be considered enemies or distinct. Algebraic analysis is now an essential part of modern mathematics.
What are some of your favorite problems?
Well, I have in my hand here a book that I once committed, titled Problems for Mathematicians, Young and Old, and it has hundreds of problems in it. Do I have a favorite? That's almost like asking a parent whether he has a favorite child. This isn't necessarily my unique favorite problem, but it is one that struck my eye just now as I was leaping through these pages. And it's a question that amuses students. In a very vague way, the question can be asked this way. If you have a bunch of things that's a small bunch, mathematical language, if you have a set that is small in some sense of measuring sets, what can you say about, let's make things specific. Let's talk about a set of numbers. They don't have to be positive integers. They don't have to be integers. They don't have to be rational numbers. Any numbers at all on the number line. Take any one set. Take all of its numbers. And then add each of its numbers to another one. If the set is called S for set, form the set that mathematicians call S plus S, the set of all sums. If we start with a small set, is S plus S also a small set? That is one of my favorites. If I'm allowed to lapse into technicalities for roughly 11 seconds, if C is the Cantor set, which is in many senses small, what about C plus C? the measure of C is 0, what is the measure of C plus C? The answers to these questions are known. These are not research problems, but they fascinate me.
What do you think about shifting your areas of interest in mathematics over time?
A vital necessity. You can't be a mathematician with only one interest, or only 100. You must have thousands or millions or infinitely many. There are people who dedicate their lives, mathematicians, to one problem or one small circle of problems. And they're not likely to be numbered among the great, among the ones who will be remembered hundreds of years or 100 years from them. It's not impossible, it could happen, but it's not likely. Very often, what's important to know is not what is the answer, but what is the question. And that kind of intellectual honesty is an essential feature of what makes mathematics what it is.
Are there examples of interesting or surprising results that come from the study of the foundations of mathematics?
Well, there are two names that must always be mentioned as you genuflect in that direction. Gödel, who proved that not everything can be proved, and pου'χω, who spoke to the point. And some people consider those things quite surprising. I'm no smarter than the next guy, especially when it comes to that subject. But I don't think that surprise is the word I would use. Gödel's result, for instance, never surprised me. Gödel's result, as I think I've commented in a different context, is essentially an examination of the sentence, and I quote, "I'm lying."
Do you see relationships between personality types and different fields of mathematics?
I know that, as I keep saying, I admired von Neumann hugely, and he was clear in his thoughts and in his expressions. I know Solomon Lefschetz slightly, and I liked him. Personally, he was a lot of fun and an interesting man, but fuzzy, totally confused and totally confusing. He couldn't reach me and I couldn't reach him at all. To a certain extent, these mathematical adjectives are connected with personal adjectives. They are both likable human beings. In fact, I might say that I liked better the one that I had less to do with. I liked Lefschetz quite a lot, though I admired and worked a lot more with von Neumann. There are those who say that von Neumann was not a great mathematician. He was prolific and he understood. He was great in understanding and in expressing himself. But it's hard to point to something definite that he created. Whereas the other man with whom I contrasted him a few minutes ago, Solomon Lefschetz, was, well, in a sense the opposite. He was a confused and confusing man, but a lovable man, a kind man, and a mathematician of a totally different kind.
Do you think of yourself as a writer?
There are various things that a person can be. One is a writer, one is a discoverer, creator of new mathematics. Well, and the writer covers other means of exposition. And if I had to grade myself in accomplishment and in hope, I would say I'm much better as a writer than I am as a discoverer. I can tell what it exists, but much less can I make it exist. What do I hope? Well, I can't hope for something that isn't realistic, so that I hope that 100 years from now, who knows, 500 years from now, something I've explained will still serve as an explanation. And that's the best I can hope.
What is your advice for people who want to be writers?
Do everything I do. That, of course, is intended to be a silly crack, but that's all the advice I could possibly give. I don't know how to do things, except how I do them. So in other words, alternate hurried, scribbled, informal writing with slow, carefully written exposition until the process converges. If you're expounding mathematics, things come in an order, or a small number of choices among various possible orders. Whereas in writing something like an autobiography, except for the order in which life goes, there isn't much of an order to the book. But still in all, I feel that everything that is written, said, expounded, has an order, has a natural order. The emphasis is bad. It might have 2 or 3 natural orders, but it doesn't have thousands. And so mainly your question is one of choice, and if you're lucky, you don't have much to choose from. The way I begin an exposition, I spoke of a course at that time, is to scribble words on a sheet of paper and then arrange the words. Well, the way I might begin a book is the same. I'd scribble words on a sheet of paper and then play solitaire with sheets of little scraps of paper to see in what order I put things. Emphasis. One of the most important tools of communication is order. In what order you present things. Two people can present exactly the same things, but one of them would be much clearer than the other because of the order in which things were arranged. At night, when I lie down in bed and turn the lights out, I don't go to sleep immediately. Sometimes I take as long as 3 minutes, and sometimes I take as long as 20 minutes. And I try to think about mathematics and try to think about how to explain mathematics. And that works pretty well. It works perhaps sometimes even better than paper and pencil.
A final question that's puzzled people for ages. Do mathematical objects exist independently of the human mind?
Yes. How do I think about mathematical objects? Do they have an existence independent of you and me? And I know the answer. I know the answer for absolutely sure. Yes, they do. You didn't invent them, I didn't invent them. You and I have nothing to do with mathematical questions, with mathematical concepts, with mathematical statements. If I were a religious man, I'd say God invented them. He gives us the questions, and if He is good and if we are good, He gives us the answers.